The night air clung to the windshield of the Oldsmobile Cutlass as it rolled through Dayton's western suburbs in the autumn of 1977. The vehicle moved with deliberate slowness, its headlights briefly illuminating yard signs supporting Jimmy Carter's young presidency, before disappearing again into the darkness. Inside, a man watched the sidewalks with patient, unblinking eyes. His fingers, covered in thin leather driving gloves despite the mild temperature, tapped rhythmically against the steering wheel. 3 taps, pause, 2 taps, pause, 3 taps again. The radio played softly in the background, tuned to WHIO's late-night jazz program. The car continued its circuit for the 3rd time that evening, following a pattern only its driver understood. The neighborhood had changed little since the early 1960s. Ranch-style homes with neatly trimmed hedges, 2-car garages, and recreational vehicles shrouded in protective covers, awaiting next summer's camping season. American flags hung limply from front porches in the still October air. The Oldsmobile's driver observed these details with the detached interest of an anthropologist studying an unfamiliar culture. He had selected this particular subdivision after 2 weeks of methodical research. County property records, newspaper subscription lists, utility connection histories, information that existed in public view but required patience to assemble into meaningful patterns. He wore a plain beige windbreaker over a button-down shirt and dark slacks, the uniform of countless middle-class professionals in the Midwest. His hair, neither fashionably long nor conservatively short for 1977, was combed with precise neatness. Even in the car's darkened interior, he maintained perfect posture, hands positioned at 10 and 2 o'clock, except when executing his rhythmic tapping ritual. The Oldsmobile itself reflected this same cultivated anonymity. 3 years old, recently waxed but not ostentatiously clean, with an interior free of personal items except for a road atlas of Ohio and surrounding states tucked neatly in the passenger door pocket. 3 houses down, Margaret Wilson, name altered, switched off her television set. The 11 o'clock news had ended with a brief weather report promising rain by morning. She secured the chain on her front door, a recent addition following reports of break-ins in neighboring Kettering, and made her way upstairs. The kitchen sink held a single coffee cup and dessert plate from her evening ritual of watching Charlie's Angels with a slice of store-bought pound cake. Tomorrow she would return to her position at the county clerk's office, where she had worked for the past 11 years since her divorce. Her name had appeared in the Dayton Daily News 3 weeks earlier, acknowledged for organizing a successful office fundraiser for the local children's hospital. Outside, the Oldsmobile eased to a stop, engine still running. The man watched the upstairs window until the light went out at precisely 11:17 p.m., matching the time noted in his leather-bound notebook for the previous 6 Thursdays. He made a final notation, started his stopwatch, and waited exactly 7 minutes before driving away. He would return in exactly 2 weeks. Patterns, after all, required patience. The Midwest in the late 1970s existed in a curious social limbo. The optimism of earlier decades had faded, replaced by a creeping economic anxiety that manifested in locked doors and suspicious glances. The energy crisis had left psychological scars deeper than the mere inconvenience of gas station lines. It had fundamentally shaken America's sense of limitless prosperity. Watergate had eroded trust in institutions once considered beyond reproach. The Vietnam War's conclusion left unresolved questions about national purpose and identity. Ohio, with its constellation of mid-sized industrial cities surrounded by sprawling rural counties, perfectly embodied this transition. The state's landscape of factories, cornfields, and increasingly emptying downtown shopping districts created islands of isolation, disconnected communities where strangers remained strangers, and local newspapers reported only local concerns. The nascent interstate highway system had begun connecting these previously isolated pockets, creating new patterns of movement through landscapes that had remained essentially unchanged for generations. Shopping malls were drawing consumers away from town squares, leaving downtown districts increasingly hollow, buildings still standing, but ecosystems disrupted. Television provided a veneer of shared experience, but beneath this superficial connection, communities turned increasingly inward. Neighborhood watch signs began appearing at subdivision entrances. Local law enforcement agencies operated as independent fiefdoms, their record systems incompatible with neighboring counties. their radio frequencies rarely coordinated. This fragmentation created natural blind spots. Gaps in awareness where patterns visible from a broader perspective remained obscured to localized observation. In this environment, Detective Robert Hargrove of the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation found himself increasingly troubled by what appeared to be unrelated disappearances across the state's western corridor. A 20-year veteran of law enforcement, Hargrove had developed a reputation for methodical thoroughness that younger colleagues sometimes mistook for obsession. At 48, his dark hair now liberally streaked with gray, he maintained the physical discipline of his early police academy days, running 5 miles each morning regardless of weather, practicing marksmanship every second Saturday, abstaining from the casual drinking that had become a coping mechanism for many of his peers. Hargrove's office at the Bureau's regional headquarters in London, Ohio, reflected his personality. Spare and functional, with case files arranged in precise stacks, colored tabs indicating status and priority. The walls held only his framed credentials, a map of the state with colored pins marking active investigations, and a single photograph of his late wife, Catherine, who had succumbed to breast cancer 3 years earlier. Colleagues noted that Hargrove had become even more dedicated to his work after her passing, often sleeping on the office couch rather than returning to his empty ranch house in Columbus's northwestern suburbs. By February 1978, his bulletin board contained 7 photographs, 4 women and 3 men, who had vanished from their homes in 6 different counties over the preceding 16 months. The victims shared no obvious connections. A 48-year-old librarian from Springfield, a 35-year-old machine shop worker from Lima, a 29-year-old nurse from Dayton, a 52-year-old retired schoolteacher from Findlay, a 33-year-old bank teller from Sydney, a 41-year-old department store manager from Pica, and a 37-year-old real estate agent from Bellefontaine. Each morning, Hargrove stood before this display, coffee cup in hand, searching for connections others had missed. He had begun using colored string to link locations on his map, red for disappearances, blue for last confirmed sightings, yellow for reported suspicious vehicles. To the casual observer, the resulting web appeared random, but Hargrove sensed an underlying structure, a pattern that existed just beyond the threshold of immediate recognition. The geographical spread initially suggested separate incidents, but Hargrove had begun noticing peculiar consistencies in the case files. Each disappearance had occurred on a Tuesday or Thursday evening, between 7:30 and 11:45 p.m. In 5 of the 7 cases, neighbors reported seeing an unfamiliar American-made sedan parked nearby in the days preceding the disappearance. Descriptions varied from dark blue to grayish-brown to simply dark-colored, but consistently mentioned an older model mid-size vehicle. In 3 instances, witnesses recalled seeing a man in what appeared to be utility company or delivery service attire in the vicinity, though no service calls or deliveries had been scheduled according to company records. Most troubling was the complete absence of forced entry or signs of struggle at any of the residences. The missing individuals had seemingly walked away from their lives, leaving dinner dishes in sinks and television sets still warm. In the case of the bank teller, Sandra Kirkpatrick, name altered, a novel remained open on her nightstand. Bookmark placed just 12 pages from the end, an unfinished story Hargrove found particularly unsettling. Personal effects remained largely undisturbed in each home, with no evidence of robbery as a motive. Banking records showed no unusual withdrawals or suspicious transactions. Credit cards remained unused. Vehicles were found properly parked in garages or driveways. The department store manager's car contained a bag of groceries purchased the evening of his disappearance. Milk, still cold, when officers conducted their initial welfare check the following morning after he failed to report for work. The local jurisdictions had classified each case according to their established protocols. Missing persons reports filed, cursory investigations conducted, notifications sent to neighboring departments. But without evidence of foul play or jurisdictional overlap, the cases quickly became cold, filed away as unexplained disappearances awaiting either resolution or the passage of sufficient time to be forgotten entirely. "We're looking at something systematic," Hargrove told his reluctant supervisor, Captain James Whitaker, in March 1978. They sat in Whitaker's office, a space distinguished from Hargrove's primarily by its window view of the parking lot and the presence of family photographs, Whitaker's wife and 3 teenage children smiling from silver frames arranged on his desk. These aren't random opportunities. Someone's selecting these people, learning their routines. Whitaker leaned back in his chair, unconsciously adjusting his tie. A nervous habit developed over 25 years of bureaucratic navigation. At 53, he had mastered the art of balancing procedural requirements against practical limitations, his sandy hair now retreating from a forehead lined with the evidence of such calculations. "Bob, you're connecting 7 cases across 6 counties with nothing concrete, linking them except timing and a vague vehicle description that could match half the cars in Ohio," Whitaker said, tapping a pencil against his desk calendar. "No bodies, no blood, no witnesses to abduction or violence, just people who aren't where they're supposed to be." "That's precisely my point," Hargrove insisted, leaning forward with the intensity that had made younger detectives both respect and avoid him. "The lack of evidence is the pattern. These aren't crimes of opportunity or passion. They're methodical removals executed with extraordinary care to avoid leaving evidence." Whitaker sighed, glancing at the budget reports awaiting his attention. The Bureau's resources were already stretched thin, covering bank robberies, drug trafficking, and politically sensitive corruption investigations. "You know I respect your instincts, Bob, but I've got Columbus breathing down my neck about clearance rates. I need my best people solving cases, not creating new ones." "If I'm right, we already have 7 unsolved cases that could become more," Hargrove countered. The supervisor, burdened with budget constraints and pressure to close cases rather than connect them, advised caution against creating patterns where coincidence might explain things just as well. Nevertheless, he authorized Hargrove to continue his investigation on a limited basis, with the understanding that his regular caseload would not suffer as a result. But Hargrove continued his investigation, driving thousands of miles across western Ohio in his state-issued Ford LTD, its trunk filled with case files and a growing collection of local newspapers. He cultivated relationships with county sheriffs and small-town police chiefs, many initially suspicious of state involvement but gradually warming to Hargrove's unpretentious manner and obvious dedication. He spoke with neighbors, co-workers, and family members of the missing, collecting details too easily dismissed as irrelevant by investigators focused on individual cases rather than potential connections. The long drives between jurisdictions gave him time to think, to mentally arrange and rearrange the puzzle pieces. He began carrying a portable cassette recorder, dictating observations and questions as they occurred to him, a habit that would later prove invaluable when transcripts revealed connections his conscious mind had noted but not immediately recognized. He drank too much coffee, slept too little, and called his daughter in Cincinnati less frequently than he knew he should, promising visits he repeatedly postponed. He began mapping each disappearance, tracking dates and lunar phases, searching for the logic behind the selection of victims. His colleagues alternated between grudging respect for his persistence and concerned whispers about his increasingly disheveled appearance and the cot he had installed in his office supply closet. Some suspected the investigation had become a substitute for the grief work he had avoided after Catherine's death, a theory Hargrove himself might have acknowledged had anyone directly confronted him about it. The breakthrough came when he discovered each missing person lived alone and had recently appeared in local newspapers. Not prominently, but in the mundane documentation of community life. A librarian photographed at a book fair, a nurse mentioned in a hospital newsletter, a real estate agent featured in a small property listing. These appearances weren't front-page news, but rather the routine acknowledgments that formed the tapestry of local community recognition, the kinds of mentions that would only be noticed by someone systematically reviewing local publications with specific intent. By summer 1978, Hargrove had convinced the Bureau to establish a task force. The meeting with the director had been tense but productive, Hargrove's methodical presentation of overlapping patterns eventually overcoming institutional reluctance. The task force was small, just 3 additional detectives and an administrative assistant, but represented official acknowledgement that the disappearances warranted coordinated investigation. The team operated from a converted conference room at headquarters, walls covered with maps, timelines, and victim profiles. Detective Sarah Lipinski, newly promoted and eager to prove herself, brought analytical skills that complemented Hargrove's intuitive approach. Detective Marcus Washington, a former military police officer, contributed organizational discipline and methodical documentation procedures. Detective Thomas Reed, approaching retirement and initially skeptical, provided institutional memory and connections with rural county sheriffs who might otherwise resist state involvement. The administrative assistant, Judith Fowler, became the team's unexpected asset, her background in library science enabling the creation of a cross-referenced card catalog system for organizing details across multiple jurisdictions. In an era before computerized databases, this analog information management approach proved crucial for identifying patterns across dispersed case files. The investigation proceeded with methodical slowness, hampered by jurisdictional disputes and the technical limitations of the era. Without centralized databases or instant communication, detecting patterns across county lines required physical files, long-distance phone calls, and endless hours of cross-referencing witness statements. Evidence collected by different departments followed inconsistent protocols, necessitating careful reconciliation of documentation standards. Photographs required physical development and copying. Audio recordings existed on cassette tapes that degraded with each duplication. Weekly task force meetings became intense sessions of collaborative analysis. The conference room table disappeared beneath case files and yellow legal pads filled with questions, theories, and action items. Coffee-stained maps tracked confirmed sightings, possible sightings, and the expanding web of connections between seemingly unrelated details. The task force members developed a shorthand vocabulary for recurring patterns and established rigorous procedures for validating potential connections before adding them to the official case theory. Meanwhile, in a modest apartment on Dayton's east side, a man sat at his kitchen table with a different set of maps and notes, methodically planning his next selection. Meanwhile, the Oldsmobile continued its careful circuits through new neighborhoods. Its owner had developed sophisticated routines built around patience and observation. He lived according to precise schedules, waking at 5:30 a.m., preparing breakfast, 2 eggs, toast, black coffee, while listening to the local news radio, departing for work at precisely 7:15, returning home at 6:20 p.m. except on Tuesdays and Thursdays, when his evening activities followed a different pattern. He maintained a sparse apartment, decorated primarily with bookshelves containing volumes on psychology, anatomy, local history, and automotive maintenance, all arranged alphabetically by author. He collected newspapers from multiple counties, driving specific routes on Sunday mornings to purchase editions from different distribution points rather than subscribing and creating a paper trail. He read each publication methodically, circling names and addresses with deliberate care, focusing particularly on community announcements, workplace recognitions, and local event coverage. These circled items were then transferred to index cards, organized by county, city, and potential interest level. He maintained a ledger of potential subjects, noting their habits with clinical precision. Arrives home 5:40 p.m. Mail collected immediately. Lights upstairs off by 10:15. No dog. No alarm system visible. Blue recycling bin indicates Wednesday collection. Newspaper delivery 6:30 a.m. weekdays. Each entry included a photograph taken with a telephoto lens from his parked vehicle, developed in his bathroom darkroom using chemicals purchased in small quantities from different supply stores across 3 counties. His selections followed criteria known only to himself, though he favored those who lived alone with predictable schedules and minimal social connections. The routine never varied. Weeks of surveillance followed by a carefully planned Tuesday or Thursday visit. He wore different clothes for each approach, sometimes appearing in work uniforms that suggested authority and trustworthiness, other times in attire that rendered him effectively invisible, the kind of forgettable figure that even attentive neighbors would struggle to describe hours later. The vehicle represented more than transportation. It was a mobile sanctuary, its trunk specially modified with partitions and soundproofing materials purchased from hardware stores across 3 different counties. The carpentry work had been done meticulously in a rented storage unit, using hand tools rather than power equipment to avoid attracting attention. The modifications included custom latches, ventilation carefully designed to be undetectable from outside, and a drainage system whose purpose was never recorded in his otherwise comprehensive documentation. The Oldsmobile itself had been selected with similar care, purchased for cash from a private seller in Indiana, deliberately chosen for its unremarkable appearance. He maintained it meticulously, performing all maintenance himself in the garage of his apartment complex, keeping detailed logs of oil changes, tire rotations, and mechanical adjustments. The car's unremarkable appearance became its greatest asset, a vehicle so common that its presence registered only as background noise in witnesses' memories. His work as a traveling notary public provided both income and cover for his movements across multiple counties. The position allowed him to develop legitimate knowledge of local geographies while maintaining a professional distance from actual community involvement. His clients, primarily banks, real estate offices, and law firms, knew him only as punctual and efficient, his personal affect so neutral that when later interviewed, many struggled to recall specific details about his appearance or conversation, despite having interacted with him dozens of times. The notary business operated with clock-like predictability, appointments scheduled weeks in advance, documentation maintained with fanatical precision, invoices submitted on the same day each month. This legitimate professional framework created natural opportunities for presence in different communities without arousing suspicion. His appointment book, later recovered by investigators, revealed a business schedule that carefully avoided the Tuesday and Thursday evenings reserved for his other activities. In late September 1978, Catherine Mueller, name altered, disappeared from her modest home in Troy, Ohio. A 39-year-old accounting clerk at a local manufacturing firm, she had lived alone since her mother's death 3 years earlier. Neighbors described her as quiet but friendly, someone who maintained her property meticulously and exchanged pleasantries but rarely engaged in extended conversation. She had recently been mentioned in her company newsletter for 15 years of service, her photograph appearing alongside a brief paragraph acknowledging her perfect attendance record and contribution to the annual United Way campaign. Like the others, she vanished on a Thursday evening, leaving behind no signs of disturbance beyond an unlocked front door, unusual for someone neighbors described as always careful about security. Her television guide remained open to that evening's listings, a cup of tea half finished on the side table. The thermostat had been adjusted to her typical nighttime setting. Her purse remained on the kitchen counter, containing her wallet, identification, and $47 in cash. Her 1974 Ford Pinto sat in the driveway, keys in her purse. The Troy Police Department conducted their standard missing person investigation, interviewing neighbors, checking local hospitals, and notifying surrounding jurisdictions. A neighbor reported seeing some kind of service vehicle parked down the street earlier that week, but couldn't recall details beyond maybe dark-colored American-made. The investigating officer noted the lack of forced entry or signs of struggle, but found insufficient evidence to classify the disappearance as an abduction. The case file remained open but inactive, one more unexplained absence in a region beginning to accumulate more than its statistical share. When notified of Mueller's disappearance, Hargrove's task force immediately recognized the pattern alignment. Thursday evening, single occupant residence, recent newspaper mention, no signs of struggle, vehicle observation consistent with previous reports. Detective Lipinski traveled to Troy to review the original case file and interview witnesses, while Detective Washington mapped the new location against previous incidents, confirming it fit the geographical distribution theory Hargrove had developed. The task force's wall map now displayed 8 confirmed cases, with 3 additional disappearances under investigation as possible matches. The pins formed a rough semicircle across western Ohio, creating a pattern invisible to investigators viewing only their local jurisdictions, but increasingly evident when viewed at the state level. The disappearances continued through the winter months, expanding into new counties but maintaining the same methodical pattern. By early 1979, Hargrove's bulletin board held 13 photographs. The task force had developed a comprehensive victim profile. Predominantly individuals between 35 and 55, living alone, with established routines and limited social circles, recently mentioned in local publications, and residing in single-family homes in middle-class neighborhoods with low crime rates. The geographical spread now formed a rough semicircle across western Ohio, with each location separated by precisely the distance one could drive in 45-50 minutes at legal speed limits, a detail that struck Hargrove as increasingly significant. When plotted on a map with concentric circles indicating driving time from various central points, the pattern suggested a perpetrator operating from a base in the Dayton metropolitan area. The team had developed a comprehensive timeline, color-coded to distinguish confirmed events from speculative reconstructions. The pattern indicated a perpetrator who spent approximately 3 weeks surveilling each victim before the disappearance, with incidents occurring at roughly 6-week intervals. This spacing suggested a deliberate, unhurried approach rather than the escalating frequency often associated with serial predators driven by compulsion. By March 1979, the task force had interviewed 237 witnesses across 13 jurisdictions, reviewed approximately 1,800 pages of official reports, and collected 42 descriptions of suspicious vehicles that might match the perpetrator's car. The most consistent elements described a mid-sized American sedan, dark in color, navy blue or dark brown most commonly mentioned, with specific details about rust spots mentioned by 3 separate witnesses in different counties. Detective Reed created a composite profile of the vehicle, which matched several thousand cars registered in western Ohio, a frustratingly broad pool of potential matches. The task force had also begun searching for similar patterns in neighboring states, establishing communication with investigators in Indiana, Kentucky, and Michigan. Preliminary research identified 4 additional disappearances that might fit the pattern, though the geographical distribution suggested these were likely unrelated cases. The team maintained strict criteria for including cases in the official investigation, wary of creating false connections that might obscure the actual pattern. In April 1979, the pattern shifted. A maintenance worker discovered women's clothing items carefully arranged in an abandoned storage room at the factory where he worked in Wapakoneta. The clothes, a blouse, skirt, and cardigan, were clean and neatly folded, positioned with evident care on a wooden chair in the otherwise empty room. The factory's night security guard had checked the room during his rounds at 2 a.m. and found nothing unusual, suggesting the items had been placed there between 2 and 6 a.m. when the maintenance worker made his discovery. The clothes matched the description of items last seen worn by one of the missing women, Ellen Prescott, name altered, the librarian from Springfield who had disappeared 15 months earlier. The factory was located approximately 20 miles from Prescott's residence, in an area with no obvious connection to her daily routines or social circles. The building's alarm system had not been triggered, and no signs of forced entry were discovered, suggesting the perpetrator had either legitimate access or sophisticated methods for circumventing security measures. 2 weeks later, men's clothing appeared in a similar condition behind a self-service laundromat in Van Wert, a dress shirt, tie, and suit pants matching items belonging to Richard Harmon, name altered, the department store manager who had vanished 11 months prior. The clothing items were arranged with the same meticulous attention to detail, the shirt buttoned and precisely folded, the pants creased exactly as they would have been if hanging in a closet, the tie knotted perfectly and draped across the shirt. The laundromat's owner discovered the items while emptying trash containers early Wednesday morning. Security camera footage, a rarity in 1979, had unfortunately been damaged by a power surge during overnight thunderstorms. The only potential evidence came from a customer who recalled seeing a plain car, maybe blue or black, in the usually empty parking lot around 1 a.m., but could provide no additional details. The deliberate placement suggested a new phase in the perpetrator's behavior, a desire for acknowledgement or perhaps a calculated escalation of risk. The locations chosen for these clothing deposits demonstrated intimate knowledge of local areas, places simultaneously public enough to ensure eventual discovery, yet secluded enough to minimize the chance of direct observation during the placement process. Pattern shifted. A maintenance worker discovered women's clothing items carefully arranged in an abandoned storage room at the factory where he worked in Wapakoneta. The clothes, a blouse, skirt, and cardigan, were clean and neatly folded. They matched the description of items last seen worn by one of the missing women. 2 weeks later, men's clothing appeared in a similar condition behind a self-service laundromat in Van Wert. The deliberate placement suggested a new phase in the perpetrator's behavior, a desire for acknowledgement or perhaps a calculated escalation of risk. The discovery accelerated the investigation. Forensic examination revealed the clothing had been professionally cleaned, with no trace evidence remaining. More disturbingly, the clothing showed signs of having been worn after the victims' disappearances. Subtle alterations in the fabric's wear patterns suggested someone else had put them on multiple times. This revelation transformed the public's perception of the case. Local newspapers began running headlines about the clothes taker and the wardrobe killer, though no bodies had yet been found. Throughout summer 1979, similar clothing discoveries occurred approximately every 14 days, each in a different county, but following the same semicircular geographical pattern. Hargrove mapped these locations against the disappearances, confirming his theory of a mobile perpetrator operating within specific time and distance parameters. The clothing always appeared in transitional spaces, storage rooms, laundromats, empty offices, accessible yet private enough to minimize risk of immediate discovery. The breakthrough came in August 1979 when a security guard at a shopping center in Lima noticed a man placing a carefully folded sweater behind a vending machine in a service corridor. The guard, having recently read about the case, noted the man's vehicle, an Oldsmobile Cutlass with distinctive rust spots above the right wheel well. Though he didn't approach the individual, the guard recorded the partial license plate. This information provided the first tangible lead. Motor vehicle records narrowed potential matches to 201 vehicles in the western Ohio region. Cross-referencing against the geographical pattern of discoveries and disappearances further reduced the list to 43 primary suspects. Field investigators began the painstaking process of elimination, checking each vehicle owner's alibi against the timeline of incidents. One name emerged with troubling consistency. Gerald Mercer, name altered, a 42-year-old traveling notary public whose work took him to multiple counties on a rotating schedule. Preliminary background checks revealed no criminal history, but several interesting details. Mercer had grown up in foster care after being removed from his biological mother at age 7, under circumstances sealed by court order. He had maintained steady employment since 1965, living in the same apartment in Dayton for over a decade. Neighbors described him as quiet and particular, someone who keeps to himself but is always polite. His job provided both mobility and a professional reason to approach strangers in their homes. Surveillance of Mercer began in September 1979. Investigators observed his meticulously organized life, his precisely timed departures and returns, his weekly car washing ritual every Saturday morning regardless of weather, his habit of wearing immaculately pressed clothes. They noted his Oldsmobile Cutlass matched the description provided by multiple witnesses, including the distinctive rust pattern above the right wheel well. Most significantly, they documented Mercer's travels, which perfectly aligned with the geographical pattern Hargrove had mapped. His regular circuit took him through all the counties where disappearances had occurred, with his notary appointments often placing him in victims' neighborhoods days before they vanished. When cross-referenced against the dates of disappearances, Mercer had no verifiable alibi for 12 of the 13 incidents. On October 4, 1979, investigators observed Mercer placing a carefully folded man's tie behind a newspaper vending machine in a Piqua hotel lobby. The tie was later identified as belonging to one of the missing persons. This direct connection provided sufficient probable cause for a search warrant. The search of Mercer's apartment revealed a dwelling of disturbing orderliness. Everything had assigned locations marked by nearly invisible pencil outlines. The refrigerator contained precisely portioned meals for each day of the week. The closet held clothes arranged by color, type, and season, with handwritten labels indicating which items should be worn on specific days. But nothing immediately connected Mercer to the disappearances. No trophies, no photographs, no obvious evidence. It was the discovery of a hidden door built to match the bedroom wall paneling that changed everything. Behind it, investigators found a second closet containing clothing items from each of the 13 missing persons. The garments had been cleaned, pressed, and arranged chronologically. A ledger detailed when each item had been worn on a rotating schedule, Tuesdays and Thursdays, precisely matching the pattern of disappearances and clothing discoveries. More disturbing were the notebooks containing detailed observations of each victim, daily routines documented with obsessive precision, newspaper clippings mentioning their names, hand-drawn maps of their neighborhoods with surveillance positions marked. A separate journal contained entries written as though from the victims' perspectives, describing their lives, thoughts, and experiences in first-person narratives that became increasingly indistinguishable from Mercer's own voice as the entries progressed. The search of Mercer's garage uncovered the modified trunk of his Oldsmobile, with custom-built partitions and soundproofing materials. Forensic testing would later identify trace evidence connecting the vehicle to 7 of the 13 missing persons. The final grim discovery came 3 days later, when investigators, acting on information from Mercer's journals, searched an abandoned limestone quarry near Bellefontaine. In a series of deep crevices, they recovered the remains of all 13 missing persons. The forensic examination revealed each victim had died from asphyxiation, likely within hours of their abduction. The bodies had been carefully preserved using techniques Mercer had apparently learned from mortuary science textbooks found in his apartment. Gerald Mercer was arrested on October 7, 1979. During initial questioning, he maintained an eerie composure, speaking in a formal, detached manner. When presented with evidence from his apartment, he displayed neither denial nor remorse, instead offering corrections to investigators' theories about his methodology. The 14-day cycle was important, he explained with clinical detachment. One must fully become before moving forward. Psychological evaluation revealed a man operating from an internally consistent but profoundly disturbed worldview. Mercer believed he could absorb others by wearing their clothes and living in their patterns. His journals described the process as completion rather than destruction. He viewed each victim not as someone he had killed, but as someone he had continued through his elaborate rituals. The trial began in March 1980, drawing national media attention to what newspapers now called the Ohio Clothes Changer killings. Prosecutors presented overwhelming physical evidence, along with Mercer's own detailed records. His defense team attempted an insanity plea, but psychiatric testimony established that Mercer, despite his disturbed thinking, fully understood the nature and wrongfulness of his actions. His methodical efforts to avoid detection, using different vehicles for surveillance, purchasing materials across multiple counties, carefully timing his activities to avoid witnesses, demonstrated clear awareness of legal and moral boundaries. After deliberating for just 7 hours, the jury found Mercer guilty on all 13 counts of first-degree murder. Given the period and Ohio's legal statutes at the time, the judge sentenced him to death by electric chair. The sentence was delivered on April 24, 1980, with execution scheduled for January 1981. However, a series of appeals delayed the process, as was common in capital cases of that era. The legal battles continued through the early 1980s, with defense attorneys raising procedural questions and challenging evidence handling protocols. Meanwhile, Detective Hargrove worked to bring closure to victims' families, many of whom had spent years wondering about the fate of their loved ones. He personally delivered recovered personal effects to family members, maintaining relationships with them long after the trial concluded. In 1983, Mercer granted his only interview to a criminology researcher, speaking for hours in the same detached, analytical tone about his work. He expressed neither remorse nor satisfaction, instead describing his crimes as necessary transformations in a process only he understood. The interview transcripts later became standard teaching material in FBI profiling courses, notable for what one instructor called the complete absence of normal human emotional registers. All appeals were exhausted by late 1984. On February 12, 1985, Gerald Mercer was executed by electric chair at the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility in Lucasville. His final statement, written rather than spoken, contained a single line: "The patterns continue without the clothes." In the years following the case, Detective Robert Hargrove became a pioneer in investigating serial offenses across jurisdictional boundaries. The methodologies he developed while tracking Mercer's geographical patterns were formalized into training programs adopted by state bureaus of investigation nationwide. His emphasis on seemingly minor connections, the Tuesday-Thursday pattern, the newspaper appearances, the driving distances between incidents, changed how law enforcement approached complex, multi-jurisdiction cases. The investigation also highlighted the vulnerability created by disconnected information systems. In the pre-internet era, the separate filing systems of different county sheriff's departments had initially prevented anyone from recognizing the pattern of disappearances. This recognition led to early efforts at creating centralized databases for sharing information across jurisdictional lines. eventually evolving into the sophisticated systems used today. For the communities across Western Ohio, the case left lasting impacts. The revelation that a methodical predator had moved among them for years, selecting victims from local newspapers and studying their habits, fundamentally changed the region's sense of security. Many neighborhoods established community watch programs, and sales of home security systems increased dramatically throughout the early 1980s. The 13 victims, ordinary people whose only connection was having been noticed and selected by a disturbed mind, were memorialized in a quiet garden established near the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation headquarters. A simple stone marker bears no names, honoring the family's wishes for privacy, but carries the inscription, "They were known and loved for who they truly were." In the decades since, the case has been examined in criminology textbooks and psychological studies, but the fundamental mystery remains. What created the profound emptiness in Gerald Mercer that he attempted to fill by literally wearing others' identities? Psychological autopsies suggested early childhood trauma and attachment disorders, but as one researcher noted, many experience similar backgrounds without developing such extreme disconnection from human empathy. Perhaps the most troubling aspect of the case was Mercer's superficial normalcy, his steady employment, polite interactions with neighbors, and methodical habits presented a socially acceptable facade, behind which existed a mind operating on entirely different principles. His ability to maintain this division between public presentation and private pathology for years raises unsettling questions about the limitations of social observation as a protective mechanism. Time gradually softens even the most disturbing chapters of local history. Today, few young residents of Western Ohio recognize the name Gerald Mercer or understand the significance of an Oldsmobile Cutlass in regional crime history. The towns and small cities where he operated have changed with economic shifts and generational turnover. Former farmlands have become subdivisions. Downtown districts have cycled through decline and revitalization. Yet beneath these visible transformations, subtle behavioral changes persist in the regional consciousness, an instinctive wariness of too regular patterns, a heightened attention to unknown vehicles appearing multiple times, a community tradition of checking on neighbors who live alone. These unconscious adaptations represent the case's enduring legacy. The recognition that darkness sometimes moves among us in unremarkable vehicles, watching and waiting for opportunities to turn ordinary lives into entries in a disturbed ledger. In the end, the case of Gerald Mercer stands as a testament to the power of patience, both the methodical patience that allowed a disturbed individual to operate undetected for years, and the more hopeful patience of investigators who refused to accept coincidence as an explanation for patterns they could not immediately understand. In the space between these opposing forms of persistence, 13 lives were lost, communities were transformed, and the invisible architecture of trust that allows society to function was temporarily but significantly damaged. The final entries in Detective Hargrove's case journals, written after Mercer's execution in 1985, reflect a seasoned investigator's measured wisdom. The most dangerous patterns are those we fail to recognize until they've been completed. Our best defense is connection, the very thing Mercer could imitate but never truly understand. This narrative is based on archives and historical accounts. Some names have been altered. We seek to understand, not sensationalize. The outcome corresponds to public records of conviction. No graphic violence was described.